Hey, what's going on, everybody? All right, so welcome to Nutrition Corner. Coach Tom here, and today we are going to chat about fat. All right, so a lot of misunderstandings and misrepresentations. We're going to try and straighten some of this stuff out for you. All right, so we need fat. We know that it's not as bad as people have claimed it to be in the past, and it still has a pretty bad rap. But we cannot survive without it. Our body uses it for all sorts of stuff, creating chemicals and hormones, cholesterol being one of them. And even hearing the word cholesterol, some of you might have cringed, but without cholesterol, our body can't make certain steroids and things like that. Let me see. Our body uses it as an energy source. So carbohydrates being the preferred source of energy for our bodies, but when carbs are not present or not present in sufficient amounts, our body turns to our stored adipose tissue or body fat, which is mainly in the form of triglycerides, but we'll get to that. Let me see. Fat is also used for metabolizing different vitamins. So that's your A, D, E, and K. So what they call fat soluble, because water is polar, fat is nonpolar. So it's able to metabolize different things that water cannot. And as such, it is not soluble. Fat itself is not soluble in water. Just like there are essential amino acids we talked about last week with proteins, there are essential fats and fatty acids. So we know most of those. We talk about the omega-3s and omega-6s the most, because those are the two big ones. Let me see. We know it's hydrophobic. It's not soluble in water, but it is soluble with other polar solvents. So that's where the ADEK comes in. And we know that it can come in a couple different forms, whether it's going to be saturated or unsaturated. And that, on a chemical level, that just refers to the carbon chain as to how the fat is actually chemically built. When it is considered saturated, that means all of the carbons are fully saturated with hydrogens. If it is unsaturated, then that means there's a double bond somewhere between two carbons, meaning that one or both of those carbons are not fully saturated with hydrogens. So we refer to those unsaturated as either mono or poly, and that just depends on how many double bonds are in that carbon chain. So if there's only one double bond between carbons, we call that a mono unsaturated. If there's more than one, then we call that a poly. Sometimes they'll break it down between like a di or a tri before it goes to poly, and that would just mean that there's 2 double bonds, 3 double bonds, or 4 or more. Typically, you're just going to hear it as mono or poly. Let me see. The unsaturated, because of that double bond, they're more easily broken down. So those are going to typically be like liquid at room temperature, things like that. More ready source of energy, but not as stable. So you're saturated because it's all single bonds there. It's chemically more stable, so it's harder to break down, i.e. it takes more energy to break that down. So when it does break down, more energy is released. Let me see. So we talked about so our triglycerides. The probably most prevalent type of fat that's going to be in your body. We talk about triglycerides a lot whenever you do your cholesterol panel. They'll talk about your total cholesterol, they'll talk about your HDL and your LDL, and they'll talk about your triglycerides in general. So the triglyceride itself, it's glycerol. It's a simple 3-carbon alcohol, and it's got 3 fatty acid chains to it. So those chains can vary, and that will change the name of the triglyceride itself, but they all share that same basic structure, where it's going to have that glycerol backbone, and three fatty acid chains branching off of it. And it's those fatty acid chains that make it the nonpolar side, and then the glycerol being the polar side. So the polar side, the glycerol can be hydrolyzed, and this is the process of hydrogenation, where we're artificially saturating that carbon chain. So because there would be that double bond between the carbon and oxygen, what we're doing is we're injecting water, so that would be hydrolysis also. You're injecting that water in between the glycerol and the triglycerides, and you're going to create something different. You're also, oh, sorry, that was a different process. I'm jumping ahead of myself. So the hydrolysis is different from hydrogenation, sorry. The hydrogenation is where you're usually introducing acid as a catalyst to heat up the oil, typically, and it's you're passing a hydrogen gas through it. So that extra hydrogen with that acid catalyst is causing the saturation of the carbon. So it breaks apart that double bond and it injects an extra hydrogen. So it saturates it artificially. And that process, you can either do it fully saturating or you can do partially saturating. And they'll use that term interchangeably with hydrogenation. So it'll either be partially or fully hydrogenated is the term that you would see on the label there. The hydrolysis portion, so that's injecting water. And then there's another process called saponification, and that's where you're adding a base, and that's how we create soaps and solvents and things like that. So let's see, going back. So with, let me see, kind of jumped around a little bit. So with the HDL and LDL cholesterol, HDL, we want higher HDL, we want lower LDL. So what they actually do is the LDL cholesterol is what brings the triglycerides from the liver out to the body. And if there's no longer a need for the cells to use those triglycerides, it gets stored, and it kind of stores it. And this is where like atherosclerosis comes in, where you get that plaque buildup on the inside of the blood vessels. That's no good. So we don't want extra LDL, because that extra LDL is just going to deposit all of the extra triglycerides into the blood vessels, and that's where things get clogged up, and that causes medical issues. So we want higher HDL, because HDL, the job of those lipoproteins is to grab the extra triglycerides from the blood and bring it to the liver to get processed. Your liver is going to process it by creating bile salts and all things like that, and then it's going to be excreted. So with cholesterol, why does the body need it, and things like that? The structure of a cell itself is, they call it a phospholipid bilayer. So it's just another type of lipid. It's got a phosphorus injection to it, and I can't remember, there's a type of acid connected to the phosphorus group. But instead of it being 3 fatty acids off of the glycerol, like your triglyceride is, one of those chains has a phosphoric group and a type of acid. I can't remember the type of acid. So it makes it that double fatty acid instead of the 3 fatty acids, so it's not a triglyceride. It would be a lipoprotein, or a phospholipid rather. That phospholipid bilayer, so remember we talked about saturation and metabolizing in water, or if it's soluble or not. So the the hydrophobic portions, so the nonpolar side of those fatty acid chains, is going to end up towards the middle. And I wish I had a sketch I could show you guys. But the hydrophilic sides is that glycerol portion, and that's going to go on the outside. So what happens is you have those 2 hydrophobic layers backed up inside. So my fingers being those fatty acid tails, and then my fists being those hydrophobic glycerols. All right, so what that does is it creates this kind of a wall here. So if you see this section in between my fingers, this is just no man's land, and then each side, so those glycerols create the walls of the cell. So the wall of a cell, if you think of the wall as just a single thing, it's not just like the wall of your house. It's not just one straight line. It's got that outer edge, it's got the inside, and then it's got the inner edge. So that's what happens with the cells. Without fats, without those fatty acids, we don't have cells. We don't have cells, we don't survive. We're just non-existent. So there's multiple processes that your body uses them for. The cholesterol we talked about before. Like I said, with the adrenals, it creates all the steroid hormones and things like that. The exposure to sunlight, where people talk about vitamin D is created from sunlight. Well, that's because of cholesterol. Cholesterol gets converted into vitamin D from exposure to sunlight, at least some of it in part. We talk about analgesics. Okay, so what happens is there's fatty acids that get converted into hormones, and our brain interprets those hormones as pain. And there's other physiological responses too. So it's like inflammation or swelling, increased body temperature from metabolic activities that cause fevers, increased blood pressure, heart rate, things like that. All that happens because your body has a fatty acid that gets converted into a hormone, and your brain interprets that hormone, and then other things get kicked into gear. That's kind of like the catalyst for a bunch of physiological processes. So what's one of the things that we do so we don't feel that pain, or we reduce that fever, or lower that inflammation? We take analgesics. We take non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. We take the aspirin, the ibuprofen, naproxen, things like that. So what happens with those? So what happens with those is those analgesics, they inhibit the enzymes that convert those fatty acids into the hormones that your brain interprets. So kind of interrupting that supply chain there, so you don't feel the pain. Not that the pain isn't there, your brain's ability to interpret it isn't there because that hormone never gets created. All right, so that's a little bit about how that works. We talk about the omega-3s and the omega-6s. We opt towards those omega-3s because they have anti-inflammatory and anticoagulant properties, as opposed to the omega-6, which has pro-inflammatory and pro-coagulant properties. Obviously, we need both. We can't just load our bodies up with anticoagulants because then our blood would be too thin. We need it to coagulate. If it doesn't coagulate, then we would virtually be bleeding to death all the time. So that's why we need the omega-6s as well. You'll get the omega-3s mostly from the fish. So that's you can get the chia, flaxseed, typically those cold water fish. So your salmon and trout, things like that. The omega-6s is more going to be from land animals and plants, so think more saturated type fats. Let me see, we talked about hydrogenation a little bit already, out of order. And then the importance that, so another wrap up for the medical side of things. The other thing that happens when our body doesn't utilize fatty acids appropriately, or cholesterols for that matter. We have things like multiple sclerosis. There's other medical conditions such as infant respiratory distress syndrome. So a lot of times what happens is if the body isn't utilizing these lipoproteins appropriately, so like in the case of multiple sclerosis, what happens is the nerve, think of it as the wire inside of the wire. And then they always have some sort of plastic coating or something wrapped around them. So you're not just holding the metal when you plug it into the wall, it's got that coating on it. Think of the lipoproteins and things like that as the coating of that wire. So if your body isn't utilizing fatty acids appropriately, that coating kind of gets stripped away from the wire, so it exposes the nerve and it causes conduction issues. It can cause misfiring. It can cause just a complete breakdown of the structure itself. And that's what kind of happens with multiple sclerosis, is the sheathing comes off of the wire, and it creates a whole host of problems. I believe that's all I have for everybody today. Yeah, all right, so come back next week. We're going to be talking about carbs.